Jimmy Arnold grew up in Fry's, a small town in southwest Virginia, and he started playing guitar in the mid 1950s at the age of 10. But just after picking up that instrument, he happened to see Reno and Smiley on the television show Top of the Morning and absolutely fell in love with the banjo. His dad thought he should stick to one instrument, but Jimmy became obsessed. He traded a pony he had for a cow, then he sold that cow and was able to buy his first banjo. A neighbor taught him the fundamentals of tuning and a few banjo rolls, and Jimmy was off. And he was one of those rare prodigies. He became very good, very fast. After only playing banjo for a year, Jimmy formed his first band. It had Wes Golding on guitar and vocals and Jimmy Edmonds on fiddle. Their first night playing together was at the auction house in Hillsville, Virginia, and that night Jimmy also met banjo player Butch Robbins. Butch had dropped by because he'd heard there were some hotshot young bluegrass musicians there, and Butch was impressed with Jimmy's playing and took him under his wing, taught him a few things. Jimmy and Wes took bluegrass very seriously. Along with Jimmy's cousin Tommy Arnold on mandolin and Wes's dad on bass, they recorded their first album on the Stark label. They called themselves the Twin County Partners. Jimmy was 12 years old. Now, that band morphed into the Virginia Cut-Ups, which was a nod to Jimmy's hero Don Reno and his band the Tennessee Cut-Ups. They even got to open for Reno and Smiley, as well as Jimmy's other hero, Earl Scruggs, who was playing with Lester Flatt. They played a few bluegrass festivals, some television shows. Jimmy was offered full-time gigs, also regularly offered alcohol, and he enjoyed both playing and drinking with the adults. He knew this was the world that he wanted to be in. But his parents insisted that Jimmy finish high school. Well, immediately after graduation, Jimmy started playing with fiddle player Joe Green, toured the world, and at a show in New York, Cliff Waldron joined Joe and Jimmy on stage. Cliff was very impressed with Jimmy's banjo playing. See, Ben Eldridge, who was playing with Cliff at the time, had quit the band. So Cliff gave Jimmy some albums to learn the songs. Well, in 1 week's time, Jimmy had learned all of the banjo parts. Cliff and his bandmates were blown away and instantly hired him. When Jimmy was 23, he ran into Dick Freeland, who was with Rebel Records. They were at a bluegrass festival, and Jimmy worked up the courage to talk to him. He asked if Rebel would be interested in a banjo solo album. Dick said anytime Jimmy wanted to record, Rebel would record it. So Jimmy went home. He spent a week working on some tunes, and Rebel Records got Mike Aldridge on dobro, Akira Otsuka on mandolin, and Gakusei Dio on fiddle. His band leader Cliff Waldron on guitar and Ed Ferris on bass rounded out the rest of the session, and they recorded the album Strictly Arnold. It took them 8 hours. Around this time, Jimmy also got married and had a daughter named Mandy. Things were starting to look up for him. Jimmy left Cliff Waldron and joined Jimmy Goodrow on mandolin, Bill Rawlings on upright bass, and a young guitar player and singer that was starting to make a big mark on the bluegrass scene, Keith Whitley. The group was variously called New Tradition and Country Store, and it was one of the top bands on the scene. But alcohol and drugs had started to not just be a part of Jimmy's life, it started to take over his life. He got kicked out of the band. It also led to his divorce, and he also lost custody of his daughter, Mandy. Jimmy had started to turn his attention to guitar. In 1977, Jimmy recorded another solo album for Rebel Records, but instead of banjo, he played a cheap classical Yamaha guitar that he had found. Akira and Mike joined him again on mandolin and dobro. Ricky Skaggs was playing fiddle, and Johnny Castle was on upright bass. The instrumentals had tastes of classical, Latin, and bluegrass, rock and roll. It featured no banjo, and once again, Jimmy's picking was just absolutely stellar in spite of his addiction issues. Now, in between guitar and banjo and drugs and alcohol, Jimmy had started to learn how to play fiddle. He ended up in Vegas playing fiddle with Judy Lynn at country concerts, and once again, Jimmy became obsessed with an instrument. Jimmy's dad had given him the timber rights to their old home in Virginia, so Jimmy sold some timber. He moved to Texas and immersed himself in the Texas music scene to learn fiddle. He played in country bands. He did some studio work. Texas also introduced Jimmy Arnold to the world of tattoos, way before tattoos became popular. Jimmy said if a man can stand that much pain, he can pretty much deal with what life has to offer him and not get too excited about it. Jimmy had a lot of pain to delve out to himself. He started to see and use his body as a canvas. In 1983, Jimmy once again recorded a solo album and once again had reinvented himself. The album was titled Southern Soul, and it was a concept album focused on stories and music from the Civil War. It had Jimmy on guitar, fiddle, banjo, and harmonica, but it also had Jimmy singing for the first time, songs he had written. Critically, it was and still is hailed as an incredible album, but commercially it just did not sell well. Frustrated with the lack of sales, Jimmy decided to step away from music in 1984. He opened a tattoo parlor in North Carolina, but the parlor eventually morphed into a front simply to sell drugs. In 1985, Jimmy was arrested and went to jail. On his release, Jimmy returned to music, and in 1992, he became a member of the Pentecostal church. He worked hard to quit the drugs and alcohol that had taken hold of him, but the drugs and alcohol had simply done too much damage. Jimmy Arnold died of a heart failure on Christmas Day in 1992. He was 41 years old. I'm going to play you a clip of one of the last recorded performances of Jimmy Arnold. This was filmed 3 years before his death. You can see the large volume of tattoos that he has. You can also see the ravages of alcohol and drugs and what that had on Jimmy's body. But even with all of that, you can see and hear the sheer talent that was Jimmy Arnold.
That little girl, what have I done that would make you treat me so? How do you call me the weak, and you call me the morning? You caused me to lose my home. I'm down the pines, in the pines, where the sun never